Good evening all, and welcome. Feeling safe in your own home is for the most part a given, but it's not always that way. There are those out there who seek to enter your home for very nefarious reasons, whether it be to take away your valuables or otherwise. So be cautious, make sure your door's locked, and let the darkness take control. I am 19 years old today, and I want to mention that this happened while I was in elementary school, perhaps 3rd or 4th grade. I was definitely a lot younger. At the time, I lived in an apartment complex, and I was on the 2nd floor of the building. I lived with my mother, father, and my cat. The apartment wasn't small, but it wasn't huge either. 2 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, with a living room and kitchen that were connected, and of course, being on the 2nd floor, we had a cute little balcony outside that you could access from the living room. So, I had overheard my mum talking about more than a few break-in attempts that had happened in the other building of the complex. Of course, being a kid, I heard everything. And though I remember most things I heard, they never really stuck with me or were processed in my mind. I was in my own little world. Plus, nothing like that had ever really happened to me before. So, why would it now? Right? I had been in a particularly good mood the day this happened. I had everything go my way, and nothing world-ending like losing my favourite rainbow pencil or breaking my butterfly-painted binder had happened. I went to school, had fun, came home, played with my friends, and even stopped by the complex's office to get some of the candy they always had in a huge dish on the table in front of the entrance. Before I knew it, the day was over, and I was ready for bed. I fell asleep quickly with no worries, hoping I'd have another great day tomorrow. I woke up at about 12:30 or 1 a.m. that night to go to the bathroom and get a drink. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed a juice, and walked into the living room area and looked out the glass door onto the balcony, where I noticed my mother forgot to shut the blinds. I tiptoed towards the door and began to close the blinds when I saw a ladder propped up against the railing of the balcony. I cupped my hands around my eyes and pressed my face up to the window so that I could make sure I was actually seeing what I thought I saw. I was right. There it was, the top of a ladder. I was about to go and wake my mum and ask her where the ladder came from, when I saw a hand reach up the last bar of the ladder. I didn't necessarily know that whoever's that hand belonged to was trying to break into my house, but I had the most gut-wrenching feeling that they weren't supposed to be climbing up my balcony at this time, or any time for that matter. I felt like I had to act fast, like by the time I went and got my mother, they would already be prepared to hurt me and my parents. I did the only thing I could do to scare them off. I flipped the balcony light off and back on again. Before I even had time to flick the light again, I heard the ladder fold back up and saw about 4 or 5 guys take off across the parking lot that my balcony overlooked. Then I saw something that horrified me. They were all carrying bats and crowbars, and one of them even had what looked like a pistol in his hand. I thought about running and telling my mum, and I honestly didn't know why I didn't. I ran back into my room and hid under the covers and stayed awake for hours, listening for anything that might be something else trying to break in, and I eventually, somehow, fell asleep. I didn't tell my mother until years later for some reason, and I haven't had a break-in experience since. That's it though. Thanks to everyone who took the time to hear this, and to the guys who tried to break into my apartment. Let's not meet. A few years back, I lived in an apartment complex. It wasn't in a bad part of town. I even lucked out, somehow managing to move into the same building as a handful of friends of mine. I thought it was awesome. A couple of months after living there, I noticed things missing. It was never anything big, like my laptop or Xbox, but my iPod and camera, and a couple of other small things vanished. I knew I just left them out in the open on the counter, but then they were gone. I figured I just misplaced them because, again, they were small items. A few times I'd get ready to leave, and my bottom lock would be locked. Now personally, I don't put much stock into doorknob locks. They've always seemed really flimsy to me, and not worth the effort, so I only ever used my deadbolt. When people would come over, I'd close the door behind them and automatically lock the deadbolt. It was a reflex. Even when I was home alone, the door was locked, but never the knob. I even felt safer using it because the deadbolt had no keyhole on the outside of the door for someone to pick. 3 times the doorknob was locked when I went to leave the house, and even though I never used it, I rationalized that sure, I probably did lock it myself. I mean, what else could it be? One day, after living there for about 7 months, I am sitting in my living room and I hear some shuffling by my front door. Since my apartment was a 1-bedroom and fairly small, I could hear it easily. I got up and moved closer, standing maybe 4 feet away from it. My heart sank as I watched my doorknob twist ever so slowly. It turned, then the door pushed in, stopped by my deadbolt. At an antagonizingly slow pace, the person on the other side pulled it closed. The door softly clicked, and I watched and listened as they slid a key into my lock and locked the doorknob. I didn't know what to do. Have you ever seen something that restarts your brain? It was so unfathomable that you can't just take in the information. That's what this was. I wish I could say I snuck up to the door and banged against it, scaring the crap out of whoever was on the other side. But I didn't. I didn't do anything, because my brain couldn't actually comprehend that someone with a key was trying to get into my apartment while I was home. The only thing that saved me was my deadbolt. And before anyone says it was a friend or my husband with a spare, no. I had the only 2 copies, I thought. Because my husband was deployed. Not even family had a spare. Everything snapped into place after that. Someone had been sneaking into my apartment and stealing stuff, and doing God knows what while I was gone, and then relocking the door behind me. And they'd attempted to do it while I was there, locking my doorknob. I mean, how many times had they been in my apartment when I wasn't home? There's no way for me to know for sure, because like I said before, I can't lock the deadbolt from the outside. Logically, I knew it had to be someone who worked in the office, a maintenance man most likely. But since I didn't look through the peephole, I couldn't find out which of the 4 guys who worked there it was. About 6 months after moving out, a friend who still lived there told me that all of the maintenance men had been fired because all of them were reported creeping around apartments and likely suspected of stealing. While this isn't outright terrifying like some of these other stories, it's still scary, at least to me. And it's another reminder to lock your doors, even when you're home. When I was a kid, my brother and I would get stuck with babysitting the neighbor's kid. His name was Alex. Alex was really fond of my Lego set that I had in the corner of my room, facing the window. He would play for hours, staying preoccupied, while my brother and I would play video games in the living room. So one night when I fell asleep on the couch while babysitting, my brother came by to me and said, "Alex is under your bed shaking." I asked, "What's wrong with him?" My brother told me to follow him to the room and try to talk him back out from under the bed. I go inside and find him on the verge of tears as he's trembling profusely under my bed. I asked him, "What's wrong? Why are you under there?" He whimpered, "Him," while looking at the sliding closet. As I walked towards the bed in order to help him out, he ran. He ran all the way back over to his house and waited on his front steps until his parents got home. Now, my parents were out to dinner with his, and he explained the whole story in detail to both his parents and mine. His explanation sent shivers down my spine when my brother and I left the house to meet up with his parents and find out what happened. My mum told me that Alex was playing with my Legos and heard a slight murmur from my closet, something that resembled a faint vocalization of, "Come here." He said that he looked behind him and noticed the closet had a slight opening with a light peering out from my lamp. He stared at the crack until he saw an eyelid open. He told us there was a man in my closet, and Alex then hid under the bed and he gave out a slight yelp, which attracted my brother's attention. My family rushes back to my house, and in horror, we find my closet door rocked open and a few things missing. My window had been left open when it was previously closed. A few things had been knocked over which hadn't previously been touched. We still didn't know what force we were reckoning with after that event. Thank God that nothing more severe happened. This story goes back 3 months or so. For background, my wife and I live in a gated community in the city of Chicago. Because of this, we see very few people in our neighborhood outside of fellow homeowners. We have an 8-year-old husky / German Shepherd mix who thinks he's more lapdog than guard dog. The only time he barks is at the 2 neighbors' dogs every day at 7:30 a.m., 1 p.m. and 10 p.m. as they walk out and back in the neighborhood. For whatever reason, he strongly dislikes those 2 dogs and angrily barks at them, despite years of us trying to get him to stop. Outside seeing those dogs, he's the most calm and friendly dog out there. Every so often, our dog will see or hear the occasional raccoon or possum on our back deck and do a more excited and upbeat bark, the kind where he wants us to let him out to go snag some fresh city pest. This may happen 2 or 3 times a year. This brings us to August or September. I am awoken by my dog barking at the back door, and it does not sound like a familiar bark of his. This barking continues and becomes more intense. It has an urgency and a sound of peril I have not heard before from him. I look at my clock, and it's about 2:30 a.m. This is incredibly abnormal, and I begin to feel very uneasy. Our bedroom faces the back of our house, so I go to the window and glance out, down onto the deck. Living in the city, it's never fully dark out. This, combined with the glow from our kitchen under cabinet lights we leave on as night lights, allow me to see a hooded man standing at my back door. His hands are at his sides, and he's staring into my house, seemingly oblivious to the sounds of my dog, who is clearly threatened by him. He's not leaning towards the door, straining to see what might be inside, as if trying to decide whether we're worth robbing. He's just standing there erect, with his hands straight down his sides. I grab my phone and go to the home app to turn on my outdoor string lights hung above the deck, which I have on a smart outlet. The lights come on, and the hooded man startles. He looks around to his sides and behind him, then runs off through my neighbor's yard, never to be seen again. This happened when I was about 12 to 13. During this time, my brother was diagnosed with cancer, so my mum was often at the hospital with him. She would randomly come home during the day to do laundry, pick up stuff, eat, and the like. At this time, my mother, brother, and I were also living at my grandparents' house. My grandparents have a 2-story house with a basement. There is a front door, and to the left, a staircase leading downstairs. The basement had 2 bedrooms, a living room, and a bathroom. When you entered the basement, you were immediately in the living room, which is where my mother slept. Then, you would go down a hall and find my room halfway down the hall, across from the bathroom, and my brother's room at the end of the hall. Sorry for the context. Anyway, one day I was extremely ill and stayed home sick. Both of my grandparents were at work, and my mother was at the hospital with my brother. I was laying in bed, sleeping, when I was woken up by a really loud stomping coming from upstairs. I assumed it was my mum, just coming home to get stuff, and was pissed she was running around like a lunatic. I sat up in bed to go upstairs to yell at her, but when I sat up, it felt like my brain had a heartbeat and was beating against my skull. So I just laid back down and went back to sleep. I'm not sure if this next part actually happened, or if I just think it did because I was delusional from a fever. I swear, I kept hearing someone coming downstairs, as our stairs were quite noisy. At the time, I slept with the TV in my room on, so I thought the people/person kept hearing the TV and got freaked out. So I'd say maybe half an hour to an hour later, I woke up, forgetting the whole thing happened, and called my mum. She tells me to go upstairs and get some Dayquil to help me feel better. So I open my door, leaning upstairs, and it's just freezing. So I stop for a minute and think, that's weird. I slowly walk up my stairs, and my door is kicked wide open, and there's stuff everywhere. I immediately ran back downstairs and tried calling my mum, who of course didn't answer. So I call my grandma instead, and she tells me that I need to call the police. I call the police, and they tell me to go wait on the driveway, so I do. And of course, as soon as the cops and I are talking, the school bus, taking all the people I went to school with, passed right by my house. As soon as my grandma got home, she gave me the biggest hug, and I just lost it. I think it was the first time since I pieced it all together I finally felt safe again. They ended up taking a portable DVD player, a Canon camera, and worst of all my great-grandmother's jewellery who had just passed away. I often think about what would have happened if I'd gone upstairs, and I don't think it would have been anything good. This happened maybe 6 years ago now. I had just graduated college and was working at a little ad agency in my city. I was living in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment with my unemployed girlfriend and my unemployed cat. It was a little 6-story building with maybe 20 apartments total just off Main Street. There was no security guard at the entrance of the building, but an automatically locking door that required a key code to enter. The 4th floor was home to a few students and couples, and my apartment was right next to a vacant studio, making it pretty quiet most of the time. After a long night in the office the night before, I didn't feel up for going into work, so I called out and turned off my alarm. I cuddled up to my girlfriend in hopes of sleeping till noon. At around 10 a.m, pounding on my front door woke both of us up, and I went to check it out. "Just a minute," I yelled, as I threw on a shirt and sweatpants, expecting a surprise visit from the maintenance man or something. In my groggy state, I couldn't really tell that anything was off, but I peeked through the peephole and didn't see anyone. Opening the door felt different somehow, and I immediately noticed a large depression in the wall 2 to 3 feet from my door. Looking down, I could see shards of wood that had broken free from the casing around the door, and I noticed the wood beginning to separate at the hinges. The hair on the back of my neck raised as I pieced together the scene. Someone had been trying to kick my door down and was pressing themselves against the wall for support. It scared us both for a while, and we slid a couch in front of the door before bed each night for a few months after that. I'm not sure what their intentions were that day, and we moved soon after. But I could never stop questioning what would have happened if they had heard my girlfriend's voice instead of mine. I live with my family in an extremely old house in the British countryside. For some background, it's your typical old English farmhouse. There's a big front door in the middle, and to your left you have your kitchen, and to your right your family room, with all the bedrooms upstairs. It was quite a nice space, and we had other buildings surrounding us that had been converted into spaces for us to use as children, that used to house pigs and other animals. However, those had been moved further afield, so that we could enjoy our privacy and not have to worry about any animals while we were just focusing at home. That's besides the point though. This happened about 15 years ago, when I still lived with my family. I was the eldest of 4 girls, and we were all very content to sleep one night. It was your standard evening. All of us had gone to bed, and my parents were probably downstairs watching TV. I'm quite a light sleeper, and would always hear when they came up the stairs, and just like every night, I did this time as well. I found it a bit harder to go to sleep than usual. Something was pressing on my mind, so I told myself I needed to go grab a drink of water. I always made sure to go down the stairs carefully. Being a very old house, creaks are prevalent, and you have to know where to step exactly in order to make minimal to no sound. I got downstairs and just stared into the darkness through the kitchen window, while slowly taking sips of my water, contemplating and thinking about what I had to do tomorrow at school. I'm being very absent-minded, and I'm not really super tired, so I was just waiting for the water to hopefully make me feel a bit full, and like I needed to go back to sleep. Just as I'm staring out though, do I notice something? It's also worth mentioning at this point that no lights were on in the house, as we tried to be as energy efficient as possible, and it was a fairly bright moon outside, so it wasn't necessary in order for me to see where I was going in the kitchen. I see a figure begin to approach from the garden. Now I also need to point out we live in the middle of nowhere, with no other houses around. I think the closest might be about a mile away, so very isolated. We don't get along well with our neighbours, if you can even call them neighbours at that distance, so it was unlikely to be them. This person is making their way with haste towards the house, and I wonder what they want. I wait to see if they're even going to come to the house, or go up our driveway into the road before I make a decision to wake up my mum, because I know she'll be pissed. I stand there in the dark, and the person arrives at the door, studying it, and walks around the house a little, looking at the windows and looking at the back door. He can't see me. At least I don't think he can. He hasn't noticed me at all. I didn't think I was standing somewhere particularly dark, and yet here I am, completely unnoticed. I don't really know what to do. Then he comes back around to the front door, and he pulls something off his back. It's black, shiny, and he starts wedging it in. At that moment it all clicks. It's a crowbar, but I can't move. I'm frozen to my spot. He makes quick work of the door, gets in, and even though it's made a fair amount of noise, none of my family have woken up or done anything about it. He goes into the hallway, and I can no longer see him, and am paralyzed with fear, whether to shout for them to wake up, whether to run and hide in a safe spot and hope that he doesn't venture upstairs, or to do something reckless and announce my presence in the hopes that I scare him off. I choose option 4 and remain glued to the ground, paralyzed with fear and unable to move. Just as I start to get brave, I think the best thing to do would be to let him know I'm there and to hopefully scare him off. We have all of our kitchen knives in holders, so I just grab 2 that are conveniently in the slots and start approaching the door silently. I could see that he's made his way into our lounge, so I start approaching it ever so quietly, making sure to step where the creaks won't be heard, in order to jump scare him in the hopes that he leaves out of fear. I get right to the door and hide next to the wall, waiting for the opportune moment. He's currently looking under the sofa and around our bookshelves in hopes to find something valuable, I suppose. I stand there, panic-stricken, waiting for the right moment, when I see something that I can't explain. He's looking underneath the sofa. If he would have turned his head any more, he would have probably seen me, when a book flies off the shelf and lands to the floor with a thud. He visibly jumps, turns around, and another book flies off the shelf and lands on the floor. I wasn't really sure what I was seeing. Not only was there a strange man in my house, but now books are flying off the shelves too? One more book comes down and lands right between his legs. It's not before long that he grabs his bag and runs as quickly as he can out of the house. I don't even think he noticed me as he left, as I took a few steps back in anticipation for him leaving. He runs out, and the loud stomping woke up my mum. She comes bolting down, shotgun in hand, ready to shout at someone. She sees the open door, and in the moonlight, someone running through the field. She turns to me, turns to the man, and congratulates me on scaring him off, and asks what happened. I explain how I saw him coming, was frightened, then he made entry, and when he was just looking around our lounge, did books start flinging themselves from the bookshelf, and that scared him off without me even having to announce my presence. My mother says that I should always shout, always make noise before they enter, to scare them off, and to tell her and my dad as the ever bigger priority. We call the police, and of course, nothing comes of it. They never find out who he was. But one burning question has always been left in my head. What happened? Was the house protecting itself? Is our house haunted? None of us had ever experienced anything remotely paranormal in the house, so I'm not really sure why, at that moment in time, did the house suddenly decide to develop a poltergeist that decided to leave just as quickly as well. Some things I'll never know the answer to, but I'm glad the house fought back, or whatever it was, to protect us from that home invader. I had awesome parents who let me sleep in the living room on weekend nights when I was very young, because my sister was a light sleeper and I could lay awake until dawn. But of course, I always end up sleeping on the couch because Nick at night made me tired. So one night, I wake up to this prickly feeling, like an insect, just bolted into a sitting position, and I started staring out the window. We live in rural Georgia, so you can imagine the magnitude of trees in perfect light cast from the moon. I see a silhouette of someone in this tree. The family dog dashes to the window and is snarling into the glass. Terrified, I run into my parents' room and try to explain to my parents that there is a strange person outside. Dad grabs something defensive and darts outside with the dog to beat the wax off the hothead. I tremble in Mama's arms until Dad comes home and says he saw no one and goes to bed. I decide to sleep in my regular bed. I fill in my sister as to what happened. Dad is making regular sounds in the house with a cup of coffee, and we are still, and I finally think that I can sleep. Nope. I notice the man outside my window. From what I can see in the moonlight, he gives me a hush signal and runs away. Just turns around and runs in a straight line away. I swear, I couldn't stop crying for what felt like hours. There were definitely a lot of sketchy things about the neighborhood I lived in. For instance, the previous resident of the house, which was next to mine, had died from overdosing on drugs. A meth house burnt down the road last year, and about 2 months ago, there was a shooting down the road at 2 a.m. And a week before, there was an attempted break-in at one of our neighbors. For some background, I was in a temporary house with my cousin and his wife and baby. I had my own little experience, but you'd need to know what his wife experienced to make it all the more creepier. So this starts off nearly a month ago, while me and my cousin were at work. His wife heard a knocking on the front door and assumed it was just my stepdad, who usually comes over by his voice. He has a key to the house, so just decides to let him open the key by himself. But he just kept knocking and asking if anyone was home. She started to get a bit worried and called my stepdad to see if it was him. It wasn't. He says our address and then states he's from Apple trying to deliver a package. The thing is, the closest Apple store is about an hour and a half away, and we hadn't ordered anything. He leaves after about 20 minutes, and then my stepdad comes over and takes her to his house. He suspected our neighbors were being watched by robbers, thinking about breaking in soon. But imagine if she'd decided to open the door alone with a baby. Nothing else happens, but we're still on guard. Fast forward to this week. My cousin's family temporary stay is over, and they leave. So I'm home alone that day. I'm moving my things to my parents for now. I'm taking out some Amazon boxes to the garbage, and decide, with that sketchy encounter, I should probably scratch out my information on the box with my pocket knife. I flip open and start, but I hear a rustling in the woods. I look for a second, expecting nothing more than a squirrel or a loose dog that's always coming around. But I see a person in a white hoodie from what I guess would be about 25 feet away. The rustling stops, and I can't see them anymore due to the dense trees. I'm stunned for a few seconds. I'm the only one there, and I only have a pocket knife. I don't even run inside for some reason, I just casually walk. Once I get inside, I stand in the kitchen, maybe being too scared to move. I think, what should I do? Call the cops? Call one of my parents? I just decide to call my stepdad, who luckily for me, was already on the way to the house to collect some stuff. He arrives 10 minutes later and looks around and doesn't find anything or anyone. I leave to work with all my valuables already in the car before this happened, and I'm definitely not going back alone for the rest of my things. Now I'm glad we're all out of that place. I'm hoping they don't decide to break in while nobody's home, but there really is nothing of value left, unless they want to steal my leftover clothes and blankets. The thought of having to live in fear because some scum want to try and steal our stuff irritates me. I hope we never meet. We grew up in a small Midwestern factory town. Snowy, freezing winters and sweltering hot summers. My parents, mother and stepdad barely made ends meet. We moved from trailer home to cramped apartment multiple times over. When I was in 4th grade, my family finally bought a house. Not just any house, an enormous house. The only problem was that the house was split into a triplex, meaning 3 families could live there in separate quarters. Since we were still dirt poor, my parents, of course, had to rent out 2 of the 3. This meant our family of 6 lived in a 2-bedroom shack section of the home. The 2nd bedroom was really just a living room off the kitchen, which I shared with my sister and youngest brother. The door to our home was in the kitchen. My dog Pepe was a natural brawn protector. He weighed about 10 pounds, but he didn't let anything past his sight without an alert. It's 3 a.m. on a 100-degree August night with 0 air conditioning, windows with too many holes in the screens to leave open, as Midwest equals mosquitoes. Fans are running on full blast throughout the space, and I wake up to Pepe barking furiously at the end of my bed. At first, I just stared at him and asked him to be quiet, figuring that he had heard a noise from one of the neighbors. Then I hear a shuffle from the kitchen. I turned left and started to try and focus past the bright lights over the kitchen sink. Then I saw something move slightly, and upon meeting each other's gaze, they froze. There were 2 men standing in the kitchen. I will never forget their faces to this day. We just stared at each other for what felt like minutes. Pepe didn't back down, but he also wasn't about to leave his post at the end of my bed. We had saved Pepe from an abusive home earlier that year in the freezing winter. He took his job pretty seriously. His bark was so loud, I couldn't even think to scream. My naked mother suddenly flies out of the bedroom next to us, screaming at the 2 men. All that I remember is her screaming, confrontation, and her chest swinging wildly in the bright glare from the kitchen light. The tallest man, at least 6'5", quietly looks at her and says, "Wrong house." Connects eyes with me, and they both turn and exit, never to be seen again. My parents decided after that we should start locking our door at night. They justified the men by saying they were probably looking for the neighbors. They didn't call the police. I was probably 7 or 8 years old. As a sheer coincidence one night, my older sister's bed broke. I had a double bed, so my parents told us we had to share for the night. No big deal. Probably at around 2 a.m, my sister shakes me awake, saying she needed to go to the bathroom. I told her to go, and said something about, "Why did you wake me up?" She insisted that I go with her to watch the door. That was something we did when we were much younger and afraid of monsters. I again just told her to go and leave me alone. She started to physically drag me from the bed, so I finally caved in and walked with her, and I was pretty much sleepwalking and only woke up when I noticed she was walking right past the bathroom. I asked her where she was going, and she said, to Mum and Dad's room. Now I'm confused. We get to my Mum and Dad's bed, and she starts to wake up Mum. Mum was a super heavy sleeper, so it wasn't surprising when Dad woke up first, slightly annoyed. He asked her what was wrong, and very quietly, nonchalantly, she says that someone crawled into bed with us. Dad sat up and had to ask what she meant, and she said, "Someone crawled into bed with us, Dad. I thought it was you, but it didn't smell like you." Dad immediately jumps up, grabs the revolver he kept under the bed, and heads to my room. I thought my sister was lying, until my dad flipped the light in my room on, and sure enough, there was a man laying in my bed. That woke me up. Dad put the barrel to his forehead and asked, "What the hell do you think you're doing in my son's bed? You better think real good about what you say next." The guy was clearly confused and looked like he was about to crap himself. He rubbed his eyes and started swearing to himself. By now my mother had called the cops and the sirens were getting closer. Dad tells the guy to get up and to walk to the kitchen, all while at gunpoint. The cops arrest him and haul him away. Apparently, what happened was he was a high schooler who had attended a party a few blocks away. He got drunk and started walking to his grandma's house. Her house was north, and he went south. He got to our house thinking it was hers, tried the locks, and got mad, thinking she had locked him out. He punched out the window in the back door, unlocked it from the inside, and made his way to his room to sleep it off. Thankfully, my parents were pretty cool and didn't crucify the kid. They made him pay for the door and requested he attend rehab, which he did. Still, not a great way to wake up. This incident happened at my dad's house a couple of years ago. Somewhat relevant to the story, my parents are still married, but live apart because of their work situations. They often see each other on weekends. My dad lives in a town of about 25,000 people, and it's pretty blue collar for the most part. His house is in the downtown area, which has been regentrified, so it's not a bad area to live in. But it's also just a stone's throw away from the worst part of town. My dad's house is also directly across the street from the main entrance to a university. So there is a university secure checkpoint just a few stops away from his front door that is manned by real police officers 24/7. My dad's house is older and has a detached garage in the back. His backyard is surrounded by a brick wall with 2 wrought iron gates, neither of which have a lock on them, since everyone usually enters through the back door. It's really just inconvenient to have a padlock on the back gates that you constantly have to lock and unlock come rain or shine. The garage door can only be opened using a key code. Inside the back gate, on the side of the garage, is a small crawl-through space that was covered with a board at the time. We have no idea why this little weird space was put there, unless it once housed an AC unit for the previous owner's workshop in the garage. One weekend, my mum arrived and visited, and was looking through the garage for some of her things she had stored there. She was particularly looking for a large floral duffel bag where she stored her sewing machine. Her sewing machine was still in the garage, but the floral duffel was nowhere to be found. She asked my dad where it was, assuming that he had used it as a suitcase, since he does often travel overnight occasionally for work. He told her that he hadn't touched it, and that it should still be in the garage where she left it. They both shrug it off, assuming that one of them had misplaced it and forgotten where it was. Fast forward a couple of weeks later. My mother is back to visit my dad, and I'm also there with my daughter. My dad walks out the back door one morning and notices the board on the little crawl-through space was damaged, as if someone had been kicking it in. He decided to go into the garage to investigate. Soon after, he called my mum and I into the garage to see what he had found. There was a piece of rolled-up newspaper that was charred black on one end. Someone had opened the back gate at night, kicked in the board over the crawl-through space, and lit a piece of newspaper on fire to use as a torch, as they glanced around the garage for, presumably, anything valuable. And the freaky part, they did all of this within 100 meters of a police security checkpoint, while all 4 of us were sleeping just outside the back door. And we were lucky they didn't find the spare house key hung on a nail inside the garage. My dad put 2 and 2 together and realized that this was probably the burglar's second entrance into the garage. A couple of weeks before, when my mum's floral duffel bag disappeared, my dad had noticed that the board covering the crawl-through space seemed loose, and had taken steps to tack it from the inside. He assumed that the burglar originally entered through the same space and stole the duffel bag, either planning to use it to store items that he would steal from other houses, or use it upon his return to my dad's garage a couple of weeks later to gather items of value. Perhaps he was spooked the first time and ran off. After the second incident, my dad had thicker boards nailed to the inside and outside of the crawl space. It remained untouched ever since. But to this day, my mum always thinks twice before opening that garage door when it's dark out. And my dad keeps a baseball bat right next to the back door. We're just glad the guy's makeshift newspaper torch didn't provide him enough light to find the spare house key and enter while we were asleep in our beds that night. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's video. A huge and massive special thank you to my incredible patrons for supporting me on Patreon. Your help makes a huge difference, and I really, really appreciate it. If you would like your name on screen, as well as a few fancy perks on Reddit and Discord, feel free to check out my Patreon, which you'll be able to find in the description, and it makes a huge difference to me. And even if you don't, thanks for listening about it. If you enjoyed the video, it'd be pretty cool to drop a like and leave a comment with your thoughts, as that always helps. And if you're new here, why not subscribe and press the little bell icon to be notified each time I post nightly spooks. If there's a story that you would like read, feel free to post it to my Reddit, or alternatively send it to my email. Just please be sure to include plenty of detail, good grammar and punctuation to ensure your story will be selected. But anyway, for now guys, it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.